junior and colleague, Dr. Himanshu. Just before starting, I would request everyone to kindly mute your mic so that there will be least disturbance while I am presenting. So today's topic that I am going to discuss about in this evening is that COVID-associated mucormycosis. As we all know, there is a resurgence of mucormycosis after this second wave. In fact, it was there after the first wave, but there is a increased incidence after the second wave. And just recapitulating the famous Bollywood dialogue, the coronavirus says to mucormycosis, "Sadak se uthakar star banaunga." Mucormycosis was there even before COVID infection started, but it was only there in the textbook. Many of us have never seen a case of mucormycosis until this period when we saw a sudden resurgence of mucor cases after the second wave. But as the saying goes, "Sadak se uthakar star banango." ये तो star नहीं बना, ये villain बना दिया. And we are seeing the menace of mucormycosis, how it is being spread all over India. So, without wasting much time, let us first discuss about the fungus. What is a fungi? Fungi is a eukaryotic microorganism. It is essentially aerobic and limited anaerobic capacity. Morphologically, it can be, just a minute. Morphologically, it can be yeasts, it can be molds, or it can be dimorphic fungi, depending on whether it is having a single cell or it is a multicellular structure, or it has got both yeast, that is the yeast form or the mold form, or the dimorphic variety having both the forms. And as far as the structure of the fungus is concerned, it is characterized by a substance in the cell wall called chitin, which is not found in any other organism. And the plasma membrane contains a particular cholesterol that is known as aldosterol. And this is the cholesterol which is the target of the treatment, medical treatment of choice, that is amphotericin B. Aldosterol is the target. It is the ATS RNA containing organism, and microtubules are there, which is composed of tubulin. So these are the knowledge we have gathered from our microbiology classes. But where do these fungi live? These fungi are ubiquitous in nature. They are present both outdoors and indoors. And in the outdoors, it may be found over the plants, over the soil, in the air, everywhere it is there. And inside the house, it is also there, even present over our human skin, even on the surfaces of our tables, or the fomites, or doors, handles, everywhere the fungi are there. But what is mycosis? The fungal infection, when the fungus infects the body, it is known as mycosis. This mycosis can be classified based on the site of infection into three categories. It may be a superficial mycosis, it may be a subcutaneous mycosis, or it can be a systemic mycosis. Superficial, that is present over the skin or the stratum corneum. Subcutaneous, it involves the subcutaneous tissue, or systemic or deep mycosis, or the disseminated variety of the mycosis that involves the deeper structures like brain, lungs, heart, liver, spleen, and kidney. Okay. So these are the pictorial representation of different type of mycosis. That is cutaneous mycosis, subcutaneous mycosis. There are three types of subcutaneous like chromoblastomycosis, mycetoma, sporotrichosis, and deep mycosis that may be aspergillosis, mucormycosis, disseminated candidiasis, mycetoma, cryptococcal meningitis. All these are come under the variety of deep mycosis. The most common invasive fungal infections inside the body are normally candidemia, or the invasive candidiasis, mucormycosis, invasive aspergillosis, cryptococcus meningitis, abdominal candidiasis, schistoplasmosis, invasive rhinosinusitis, and pneumocystis pneumonia. Okay, so what is this invasive? Just a minute. This is not going. Good, just. Yeah. I want to remove this bar.
Okay.
Sure.
Can it go all together? It will be there. Huh?
It will be there.
You can move it here and there, but it will not go. So this invasive deep mycosis or fungal infections, there are of two types. There may be primary fungal infections or primary deep mycosis, that is present in a normal host. They produce infection in a normal human being. These pathogens usually gain access to the host by the respiratory tract. So in a normal host, having a normal immunity, the infection, the fungal infection goes inside the body through the respiratory tract. Examples like coccidioiditis, Histoplasma capsulatum, blastomyces, and paracoccidioiditis. But there are a few other fungal pathogens which are opportunistic in nature and cause deeper infections, like when the body immunity is low, or the patient is having immunosuppressive therapy, or he is having HIV/AIDS, or he is suffering from some malignancies of hematological or some solid organs. So in these cases, what happens? These opportunistic fungi cause deep mycosis through various other routes apart from respiratory tract, like alimentary tracts, and intravascular devices. If through the any intravascular cannula or any intravascular devices that are transplanted into the body, to them also they get access to the inside of the body. The examples like Cryptococcus, Candida, Aspergillosis, Penicillium, and of course our the organism of our discussion, that is mucor. So these are deep mycosis in common. So this is not to terrorize you, but these are the pictures, various pictures of mucormycosis, or the black fungus that is commonly known by the common people, and that has been advertised through the different types of media, print and electronic media, as black fungus. But the name black fungus is probably a misnomer, because the fungus is neither black, but because the lesion that it produces, that is the eschar, is black in color, probably because of that it has been regarded as a black fungus. It can affect the head and neck area in a very devastating way. But it can affect the nose, it can affect the eyes, it can affect the palate, the cheek, even it can enter deeper inside into the brain. So this is the mucormycosis or black fungus that we'll be discussing today. So these fungal diseases can be classified. Fungal diseases affecting the sinuses can be defined as can be classified into two categories. It may be acute or chronic. The depending on the duration of the disease. If it is less than 4 weeks, it's acute, or more than 4 weeks, it's chronic. Or it can be invasive or non-invasive. So how to differentiate between invasive and non-invasive? An invasive fungal disease is one uh, where the fungal hyphae are present inside the mucosa, submucosa, bone, or blood vessels, and nerves of the paranasal sinuses. If it invades the mucosa and submucosa, it's an invasive disease. Or when it is present just above the mucosa, it is a non-invasive disease. If it is present less than 4 weeks, it's acute, and if it is more than 4 weeks, it is chronic. So this mucormycosis comes under the category of acute invasive fungal sinusitis. So to classify, this fungal disease is an acute invasive fungal sinusitis. So coming to the mucormycosis, it's an angio-invasive disease because it has the propensity to invade inside the blood vessels. So it is an angio-invasive in nature, and the organisms that come under this group of fungi, that is mucorales, they cause this angio-invasive type of disease. And the organisms that come under this group are Rhizopus, Mucor, Rhizomucor, Paningamella, and Absidia. As I already told you, this is ubiquitous in nature, present everywhere, occurring naturally, and the natural habitats are found in soil, plants, manure, decaying fruits, and vegetables. The prevalence in India, the prevalence of mucormycosis is approximately 0.14 cases per 1,000 population, about 80 times the prevalence in developed countries. For various reasons, the incidence of mucormycosis in India as such is very high as compared to developed countries. One of the reasons may be because the incidence of the prevalence of this fungus is very high in India as compared to other Western countries. Besides other predisposing factors, because of the presence of high prevalence of the organism mucor inside in our country, maybe this is there is a higher prevalence. But this COVID-19 has changed the scenario. This COVID-19 infection has been associated with fungal infection, particularly this mucormycosis. The incidence has risen many folds post-COVID. So this rising mucormycosis in patients with COVID-19, another challenge for India amidst the second wave. Now we are going to face the third wave, but the second wave has already attributed one of the villains of who has not known to many before a few days, that is a mucormycosis. The incidence has arisen more rapidly during the second versus the first wave in India. As Mr. Pandey was asking me, there are many reasons that can be attributed that we will be discussing during the course of our discussion. Till May 28, 2021, around 14,872 cases have been reported in India. And India contributed to approximately 71% of the global cases. That is, this data has been published in a literature from December 2019 to April 2021. In India, the states that contribute mostly towards the incidence of the resurgence of this COVID are Gujarat and Maharashtra. The most maximum number of cases have been found in these two states. Apart from them, Rajasthan, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, Haryana, Madhya Pradesh, Uttarakhand, and Delhi have also shown a steady rise in the incidence of COVID, this mucormycosis cases. In our state, that is Odisha, though the situation is not so alarming as compared to the other states like Gujarat and Maharashtra, but definitely we have seen a more number of cases in recent 1 or 2 months as compared to last 10 to 15 years. Probably I had never seen a case during my previous career that I have seen around 20 to 25 cases in these last 1 month. A steady rise in the number of cases and deaths have also occurred that are related to the mucormycosis, and several states already have declared it as an epidemic and notifiable disease to the national health authorities. In Odisha also, it has been declared as a notifiable disease. Any case of mucormycosis that you are treating, you must notify to the government for record and for their follow-up. So, coming to the risk factors that are associated with mucormycosis, that is, in general, before COVID and after COVID, that is COVID and non-COVID patients. The before COVID, it was there, mucormycosis was there, but it was confined to the patients with uncontrolled diabetes mellitus, those patients who were taking immunosuppressant drugs, those who are having HIV/AIDS, iatrogenic immunosuppression due to as a result of any chronic diseases like rheumatoid arthritis or SLE, they're taking immunosuppressive therapy and steroids for a prolonged period. And most commonly, it was there associated to hematological malignancies and those who have undergone organ transplantation. But post-COVID, the mucormycosis cases has risen. Please mute yourself, Mr. Whoever is there. So the factors that are attributed to increased incidence of mucormycosis cases post-COVID are first diabetes, high dose of steroids being used, diabetic patients, those who are affected by COVID, and they are being treated, as we all know, the treatment for cytokine storm, anti-inflammatory agents like steroids and IL-6 inhibitors like tocilizumab. These are the factors responsible for lower immunity. And associated with COVID, there is neutropenia, there is lymphopenia, there is high level of IL-6 and ferritin. Ferritin, as we all know, this organism mucor has very high affinity for iron. It thrives on the iron. That is why, because there is increased level of ferritin in COVID cases. So this is one of the reasons. Broad spectrum antibiotics also decrease the immunity. Contaminated humidified oxygen, there is a lot of controversy regarding this because of this contaminated industrial oxygen. Some say this is the reason why there is an increased incidence. And some people also attribute to the soiled mask, the mask being used for a prolonged period, the sweats that are that soak the mask. That becomes a very good media over which the fungus grows. So soiled mask, uncleaned mask used for a prolonged period is also attributed for development of mucormycosis. Excessive steam inhalation, some people say, because the steam, because of the hot steam when it is inhaled, that hampers the mucociliary clearance and that produces a conducive site for the growth of the fungus. Some people attribute zinc. Zinc is a micronutrient which is required for the growth of the mucor. The zinc being utilized, being consumed like anything during this COVID pandemic is also another cause. But there is one question that is still unanswered with the strain. This Delta strain that is being that is responsible for the second pandemic in India. Probably there is some link between this Delta strain and the development of mucormycosis. The link is yet to be found out. So, what are the different characteristics of this mucor? So that is so how this mucormycosis get propagated during this COVID-19 pandemic? So one of the characteristics is thermotolerant. They are efficiently able to survive at a temperature of 37 degrees. Thus, they can survive the raised body temperature. And in most infections, including COVID-19. And known risk factors for mucormycosis, as I told you, SARS-CoV-2 infection, including raised ferritin, immunosuppressed condition, diabetes like state and endothelial damage. They contribute towards the development of diabetes, dysregulation of ACE2 expression. This dysregulation of ACE2 expression not only in lungs but also in other organs like esophagus, pancreas, ileum, colon, cardiovascular and renal tissues. And this leads to a cascade of pathways that craft a suitable microenvironment for opportunistic infections like mucormycosis. So there's a flowchart, as you can see. This steroid, hormonal, and immunoglobulin therapy in the COVID-19, what happens, there is a direct thrombosis causing endothelial damage. There may be various hematological alterations ultimately leading to hemolysis and raised ferritin level, ACE2 mediated alveolar damage leading to lactic acidosis and reduced pH, direct damage to pancreatic beta cells, diabetic like state, raised glucose level, reduced chemotaxis, neutrophils, impaired phagocytosis, reduced transmigration. All these factors that altogether produce a milieu that where which is conducive for growth of the mucor. So probably this is this strain, Delta strain, because of this all these biochemical alterations inside the body, inside the particularly in the head and neck area, they produce a milieu where which is conducive for the growth of this fungus. So this mucormycosis, we can divide them, we can classify them into different varieties. Most common in this post-COVID scenario is a rhinocerebral or sinus or brain involvement, this mucormycosis. And next common is the pulmonary mucormycosis, but though not so common as compared to rhino-orbitocerebral mucormycosis. The pulmonary is next in the line in people with cancer and in people who have got an organ transplant or a stem cell transplant in pre-COVID era. And gastrointestinal mucormycosis can also occur. Cutaneous mucormycosis, disseminated mucormycosis are also the other types of mucormycosis. Coming to today's topic, that is COVID-19 associated mucormycosis. The commonest presentation is rhino-orbitocerebral mucormycosis. The other one being pulmonary mucormycosis. The pulmonary mucormycosis, they present in the form of fever, cough, chest pain. There may be pleural effusion or hemoptysis, or there will be worsening of respiratory symptoms. But to diagnose the pulmonary mucormycosis, we need a CT scan of the chest. That the CT scan may be confused with the COVID-related shadows. The mucor shadows may be confused with the COVID-related shadows. But yeah, you can suspect mucormycosis in patients with thick-walled lung cavity. Okay, so the cavity lesions that will be thick-walled. And this thick-walled lung cavity need to be differentiated from COVID-associated pulmonary aspergillosis also, because aspergillosis and mucor, both of them can occur simultaneously, or it can occur individually also, and both of them affect a immunocompromised patient, just like a COVID-recovered patient. So the other characteristics of CT scan in a pulmonary mucormycosis is reverse halo sign, multiple nodules, pleural effusions are also there. But the most important thing is you have to do a test for galactomannan and beta-glucan, because these are positive in aspergillosis, pulmonary aspergillosis, but they will be negative in mucormycosis. So repeated negative results of galactomannan and beta-glucan test, along with clinical suspicion of pulmonary mucormycosis, gives rise to a diagnosis. But today's topic is rhino-orbitocerebral mucormycosis is the most common form of mucormycosis. So before discussing in detail about this rhino-orbitocerebral mucormycosis, we must know that the treatment of such patients is the teamwork. It involves different departments like the ENT. Of course, the major part is played by the Department of ENT, but the treatment is incomplete without the involvement of microbiologists, pathologists, radiologists, physicians, ophthalmologists, neurologists, neurosurgeons, MACFAX surgeons, plastic surgeons, intensivists, infectious disease specialists, everyone. We need the help of every specialty for a complete diagnosis and treatment of a patient of rhino-orbitocerebral mucormycosis. So the clinical features of rhino-orbitomucormycosis, initially, most of there are 4 stages of disease progression. First is nasal, then is sinonasal, then is sinonasal orbital, and fourth one is sinonasal orbito cerebral. Okay. So in the nasal phase, the patient, if the patient presents in the earliest phase, that is the patient with a nasal blockage or congestion or nasal discharge, that may be bloody or brown or black color discharge, or there may be some local pain. But in case when the disease enters into the sinuses, all the paranasal sinuses, we all know that just adjacent to the nasal cavity, there are 2 maxillary sinuses. Above there are ethmoidal sinuses, frontal sinuses. Behind there are sphenoid sinuses. When the sinuses get involved, then the patient complains of facial swelling. There may be pain or numbness or swelling over the face. There may be headache, or there may be some orbital pain because of the involvement of the intraorbital nerve that is passing just below the floor of the orbit. Because of involvement of the intraorbital nerve, there may be some pain or there may be paresthesia over the cheek. So if the lower surface of the sinuses are involved, maxillary sinuses are involved, that is the upper alveolus is involved, there may be tooth hack, or there may be loosening of maxillary teeth, there may be jaw involvement, there may be palatal ulcer or blackening. As you can see, there is a palatal ulcer over here, and there is a swelling over the maxillary area, and there is a swelling over the nose. There's a ulceration and blackening of the palatal mucosa. As you can see, the infection has spread from the maxillary sinus to the palate, and intraoral post discharge may be found in some cases. So if it has involved the orbit, there may be blurred or double vision with pain, paresthesia, fever, skin lesion, thrombosis, and necrosis of the eschar formation. And if it involves the brain, there may be altered sensorium, confusion, or behavioral changes. So it may so happen that though it progresses from stage 1 to stage 4, from the nose to the paranasal sinus to the orbit to the brain, but sometimes what happens, this order of infection is not maintained. We have got one case. One of my psychiatric colleagues have called me one day. One patient presented with psychotic symptoms when he post-COVID. He presented with psychotic symptoms, and when he examined and when he prescribed him anti-psychotic drugs, he was not getting any relief. But when he did a CT scan of the brain, he found a frontal lobe abscess, and when he went for a MRI, the abscess contrast enhanced MRI, it was suggestive of mucormycosis. So the point of telling is that it may involve CNS without involving the nose also. The mechanism is yet to be known. Additional ocular findings, that there may be eyelid swelling, there may be orbital pain, there may be epiphora because of the involvement of the lacrimal sac or the lacrimal duct, there may be epiphora, there may be ptosis, there may be cryptosis because it involves the orbit, the retrobulbar area, the muscles, the space occupying lesion is there, that causes cryptosis. Because of involvement of the different extraocular muscles, there may be restriction of movement of the eyeball, and there may be vision loss. This vision loss in mucormycosis can be due to involvement of the optic nerve by the direct infiltration, but most commonly without any other symptom. If the patient presents with vision loss per se, we have got one patient who presented with vision loss without having any other cause of any other manifestations of mucormycosis. Only complaint was vision loss, and here the cause is attributed to central retinal artery occlusion because of the thrombotic phenomenon. The emboli has gone and blocked the central retinal artery, causing vision loss. There may be ophthalmoplegia, there may be panophthalmitis also as a ocular finding. So these are all the cases. These are all real cases. These are frightening cases we have got after this second wave. One is having a complete ocular or orbital involvement, having eschar over the eyelids. There is a palatal eschar. Another patient having complete necrosis of the face over the maxilla, over the periorbital swelling, numbness, and this patient came out to be muco-positive. So, the how to diagnose a case of rhino-orbitocerebromycosis. So in the algorithm, the first step is high index of suspicion. Any patient who has recovered from COVID is a non-diabetic, complaining of headache or nasal congestion or paresthesia over the face associated with nasal discharge, particularly if it is blood-stained or if it is blackish in color. So you must suspect it to be a case of rhino-orbitocerebromycosis until it is proved otherwise. So high index of suspicion is the first step in the management of ROCM. The next step will be diagnostic nasal endoscopy. The diagnostic nasal endoscopy is the earliest tool by which we can diagnose a case of mucormycosis, nasal mucormycosis, because this is a non-invasive examination. If you come across any such suspicious cases, kindly send it to the nearby ENT doctor or ENT surgeon in your area. So he will examine the nasal cavity with endoscope. But of course, there are sometimes the cases may be missed if it doesn't involve the nose or the paranasal sinuses. It may be missed, but in most of the cases, it will be diagnosed as there will be a blackish discharge, there will be discoloration of the mucosa of the nasal cavity, or there will be formation of eschar inside the nasal cavity. So from there, our suspicion will gradually increase, and we'll go for confirmatory test. For the confirmatory test, by nasal endoscopy also we can take a biopsy. As we know, for your information, this diagnosing, the gold standard of diagnosis of mucor cases are finding the fungi in the lesion. So how to find the fungus in the lesion? If you have found out the fungus in the lesion, then it is a 100% diagnosis. But how to find out the fungus? The microbiologist people, as per the guideline that say, if you take a swab and send it for the culture, it is not the method. Is the sample is not sufficient. You have to take a biopsy. Biopsy will give you a 100% result. So you have to take a punch biopsy under the guidance of the endoscopy. We take a biopsy and divide the sample into two halves. One half we send it in the normal saline for KOH mount and for fungal culture to the Department of Microbiology, and the other half we send it to the Department of Pathology for histopathological examination. So after getting the results, this is the tissue diagnosis, which will confirm the diagnosis to be a case of mucormycosis. But for planning for the surgery, we need imaging. We need to know what are the structures that are involved, which are the tissues that are involved. For imaging, there are two tools are there. One is CT scan, one is MRI. Out of these, MRI is a gold standard of diagnosis. This is a gold standard for the diagnosis of mucormycosis. It has got many advantages of a CT scan that I'll be discussing. So there are the images that that will be asked for in MRI is a T1 images, T1 gadolinium enhanced images, and T2 fat suppressed images, and diffusion-noted images. These four types of images are normally required for diagnosis of mucormycosis. And if you suspect there is association of aspergillosis, then you have to do a beta D glucan and galactomannan assay to rule out pulmonary aspergillosis. So, having a high index of suspicion, diagnostic nasal endoscopy, taking a biopsy, KOH mount, fungal culture, histopathology, and imaging, you have now we are ready for treatment. So the pictures, these are all real pictures that we have taken. Sorry for the poor quality of the picture. So these are the eschars present inside the nasal cavity. As you can see, this is the septum, nasal septum. This is the suction cannula. This is the nasal septum. This is the inferior turbinate, and this is the eschar, the blackish eschar that is present inside the nasal cavity. Pardon?
Your slides are not visible.
Not visible. Why?
I mean, it's visible, sir, but it's not moving.
Not moving.
We can see the clinical feature slide.
It's not moving. The same slide is being focused.
Yeah.
So should I stop sharing and then
You
share again?
You can do a, you just stop share and share again.
Now?
Yes.
Yeah. Now you can see.
Okay. So the nasal endoscopic picture. So this is inside the nasal cavity. You can see the blackish eschar. So this is the eschar here. This is the eschar here. So the by nasal endoscopy, you can do. You can just examine the presence of the evidence of the fungal infection inside the nose. Then we send it for a KOS mount. These are all real pictures of our patients. So then you can see the accepted fungal hyphae of the mucor in the high power field. These are microscopic pictures. This has been taken after the KOS mount. Of course, some patients, they have done a fungal culture. You can see the growth of the fungus over the several dextrose agar medium. These pictures have been collected from the Department of Microbiology, and the tissues that we have sent after the surgery are being analyzed by the pathologist, and you can see the histopathological pictures showing the mucor inside the sent tissue. So the diagnosis is now confirmed. So next, we should know the extent of the disease by radio imaging. So the gold standard of diagnosis, gold standard of imaging is gadolinium MRI over CT scan. Why? Because gadolinium MRI or MR angiography, they determine the extent of the cavernous sinus involvement and ischemic damage to the CNS. Also, the extent of extent to which we will dissect, we will do surgery during our surgical method. So the MRI will guide us in the surgery. So absence of paranasal sinus involvement has a strong negative predictive value in imaging studies. So if PNS is not involved, then you have to think again and again, because of course there is a the CNS may get involved without involvement of PNS, but it is very unlikely, very rarely it occurs. So you have to look for PNS involvement for a diagnosis of mucormycosis. So the role of CCT is almost nil in case of radio imaging of mucormycosis. Few senior ENT surgeons, as they said, tell the role of CCT is only in case of when MRI is not available, or the patient cannot afford for an MRI, or if the patient is very uncooperative for MRI, because for MRI it takes a longer time for taking the images inside the gantry, the claustrophobic the patient is, then the patient is not cooperative for undergoing MRI. So in this case, in those cases, at least you can get a CT scan picture. But if available and if it is affordable and if the patient is cooperative, then you must 100% go for an MRI, that is gadolinium enhanced MRI. So what is the advantage of MRI over the CT scan? Because the CT scan, if you go for a CT scan will give this much information only. What are the different areas sinuses involved, and if there is any bony erosion or not. So this much information you will get. You will not get any other information. But if you go for a CT scan, for MRI examination, particularly the T2 weighted MRI and T2, this is T2 fat suppressed MRI, and this is T1 with contrast. As you can see in the T2 fat suppressed MRI, here the ethmoid sinuses, the turbinate, the inside of the nasal paranasal sinuses, these all there are there is hyperintensity in the T2 weighted MRI. But if you go for a T1 weighted with contrast of the at the same level, we can see there is hypointensity over the area where it was hyperintense in the T2. Because what is the cause of this hypointensity? here, as you can see, the turbinate was hyperintense here, but it has become hypointense. It is because because the affection, because due to affection of the mucor, because it is angioinvasive disease, it has blocked all the capillaries, all the arterioles supplying that area, and the contrast agent is not able to reach that area. So when the blood is not able to flow to that area, how the contrast will release? So there will be less enhancement. But in T2 there will be hyper intensity. So in CT scan, of course, you will get a lesion over here. But in MRI, I will not get any lesion. This is called as black turbinate or double shadow sign. Okay. So again, similarly, another picture here, the maxillary sinus is full. Of course, if in case of CT scan, if you do a CT scan, you will see that left maxillary sinus is completely filled with this purulent material. But if you go for a MRI, again, this turbinate is again black. Here the turbinate looks normal, but the turbinate is actually involved. So the MRI will actually guide you to what extent you will go for, during the surgical maneuver, to what extent you will go, and the CT scan you may get that information always. So MRI is a diagnostic modality of treatment. So you have diagnosed the case to be mucormycosis, and you know the extent to which it has involved. Now the treatment. The ability to treat mucormycosis effectively depends on the availability of the surgical techniques and antifungal agents. These are two things. Surgical surgery and antifungal is combined together is a complete treatment. There is no role of surgery in the absence of the surgery. If you do a surgery in the absence of antifungal, the treatment is incomplete. Also, if you go on giving antifungals without doing surgery, also the treatment is incomplete. So the two prongs of the treatment is surgical, surgery, and antifungal. In any immunocompromised patient with suspected mucormycosis, immediate treatment initiation is strongly recommended because it's a highly rapidly spreading disease. Once you diagnose it to be a case of mucormycosis, you have to treat it immediately before it involves any other important vital structure, because in the head and neck area, all the structures are present in a very small area in a compact way. Even 1 centimeter involvement, 1 centimeter more involvement will affect any other vital organs, vital structures. So before it invades more further, you have to control it then and there. So treatment, early initiation of treatment is very important. So every attempt to attain a diagnosis should be made at the time of initiation of therapy, but should not be delayed. But it should not delay the therapy. So you should go for any other diagnosis, other blood investigations, everything. But should not wait for the result. But if you assure that it is mucormycosis, then start your treatment then immediately. So treatment is a three-pronged approach. First is reversal or elimination or control of predisposing factors. There are many, normally these mucor cases are very critical patients. They are having many comorbid conditions. They are having mostly they are high diabetics, having nephropathy. They may be having some hypertension, cardiac ailments. Some of them may be under dialysis. So you have to treat the mucor side by side. You have to treat all other predisposing factors also. And then aggressive surgical debridement and antifungal therapy and supportive medical therapy, as I told just now. So there's a global guideline for the diagnosis and management of mucormycosis that also says the same thing. First is appropriate imaging. You have to diagnose, then go for a surgical debridement. And then the next first line treatment is high dose of liposomal amphotericin B, the drug of choice, is strongly recommended. But when it is not available, it is a practical problem. It's through a pan-India, there is a scarcity of liposomal amphotericin B. It's not available in many places. In those situations, there is another alternative, though it is not as effective as liposomal amphotericin B. You can go for a isavuconazole or intravenous posaconazole also. It is sometimes recommended. So these are recommended as salvage treatments. In case of renal failure, these CRF patients, chronic renal CKD patients, they may be having some problem with amphotericin B. In those cases, you can think of posaconazole or isavuconazole also. So medical treatment, that is control of diabetes and ketoacidosis. You have to reduce the steroid dose, discontinue any immunomodulated drug like tocilizumab or being given. Antifungal treatment, you have to install adequate hydration is to be maintained, and you have to monitor the patient clinically, endoscopically, and radiologically. This is very, very important after surgery and after installation of antifungal drugs. You have to monitor the patients because this amphotericin B has got many side effects. Like first is it is a nephrotoxic drug. Second, it causes hypokalemia. So patient may land up in very severe hypokalemia if you are not monitoring the patient. You have to monitor urea creatinine. You have to examine the patient endoscopically at regular intervals. You have to take out all the debris, the scar, that has been accumulated inside the operated areas. So you have to take out them, and you have to do radiological examinations. That is also controversial. Of course, controversial radiological that I will be dealing later in my discussion. Surgical treatment for mucormycosis, the recommendation is the guidelines group strongly supports early complete surgical treatment in addition to systemic antifungal treatment. It's not a substitute, it's an addition to systemic antifungal treatment. Rejection or debridement should be repeated if required. So once you do a debridement, the surgical treatment is adequate debridement. The debridement of all the necrotic or debris, you have to debride go on debriding until you meet a healthy tissue. Endoscopically, or if endoscopically it is not possible, then through the open approach, you just open the area and go on debriding until you meet healthy tissue that bleeds during the surgery. So that is the limit of your dissection during debridement. So what is the extent of the surgery? You go on for a surgery of mucormycosis, it can be a simple biopsy, endoscopic biopsy. You can go for a medial maxillectomy, or you can go for an endoscopic modified Denker's approach or Calderon's approach, or it can go. You can even in cases where the pterygopalatine fossa or infratemporal fossa and skull base in some cases are involved. So you have to go up to that extent. You can remove the palate if it is involved. You can remove the eyeball, or if the orbit is involved or orbit has been infiltrated and there is no vision, you can go for eyeball exenteration. You can debride the skin if it as I have shown in the picture. So if the skin is involved, you can debride the skin. So in some cases, you may require the intervention of the neurosurgeons when the brain is also involved. So after debridement and after excision, now comes the reconstruction. When the patient recovers, you can go along with the help of a plastic surgeon. You can reconstruct the external deformities that has been formed. So these are few the pictures of different extent of dissection. So here, what we have done. Sorry. So we have done an endoscopic modified Denker. This is, as you can see, the floor nasal cavity, the septum. This is a resected maxilla on the right side. Endoscopically, we have removed all the necrotic debris that have been found until we meet a bleeding point. When the tissue starts bleeding, we stop our dissection. This is another case, another such case. This is the maxillary sinus. This is the maxillary sinus. This is a postural of the maxilla. The entire medulla of the maxilla has been removed by endoscopic Denkers. So here the disease has already progressed a little further into the pterygopalatine fossa. Just behind this postural of maxilla is a key area, that is the pterygopalatine fossa. Once the disease enters the pterygopalatine fossa, this small squarings area is a key area from where the infection can spread to the orbit, to the orbital apex. It can spread to the cavernous sinus. It can spread to the middle canal fossa through the foramen ovale to the foramen rotundum. It can spread to the nasopharynx along the descending palatine vessels. It can spread to the sphenopalatine artery and necrose all the lateral nasal wall mucosa. So this is a very key area, this pterygopalatine fossa. If it is involved, then you have to dissect the disease from there. And many times what happens, the sphenopalatine artery, and you can see this is the internal maxillary artery inside the pterygopalatine fossa that has been found to be thrombosed. So because of the thrombosis of this internal maxillary artery, the branches of this internal maxillary artery supplying to different areas that get ischemic and necrosed. So you have to dissect this internal maxillary artery in the pterygopalatine fossa. or infratemporal fossa, and until the period until the level where you find a fresh bleeding. Okay, this is the teriparatine fossa approach. And some cases there may be involvement of the sphenoid sinus of the cleavus. You can see this is the clivus, this is the sella, this is a paracellular carotid on both the sides. So up to base of skull, you have to also go to remove the disease. So in case of orbital involvement, there is surgical management. One is first is transcutaneous retrobulbar amputation B, that is called TRAM. So if there is a limited involvement of the retrobulbar area, we give a mostly the ophthalmologists, we seek the help of ophthalmology people. They give a transcutaneous retrobulbar amputation B injection of 1 ml in volume, containing 3.5 milligram of amputation B. But if there is limited orbital involvement and the vision is there, the patient is able to visualize, the vision is normal, then we go for a limited orbital debridement and take out the limited tissue, limited orbital content that is involved by the mucus. But if the involvement is very extensive into the orbital cavity, and if the patient has lost his or her vision, then we have to go for orbital exenteration. That is, remove the dead necrotic tissue and reduce the bulk of the eye. So in one such case, this is a very devastating surgery. In one such case, we had to remove the eye orbit of the this patient in total, because he was having no PL and PR, and there is involvement of the orbit. So we were forced to remove the eye, but it is very such a cruel surgery. It's a very devastating surgery. And of course, there is a guideline which is normally followed, that is being formulated by Dr. Renuka Prado and et al. From Sion Hospital. That is Sion Hospital scoring system. Depending on the clinical feature, the ophthalmological feature, the radiological feature, they have classified, they have given a gradation system. If the total score is 45, if the score is more than 23, then the patient is a candidate for orbital exenteration. So now something about the amphotericin B. This liposomal amphotericin B is a treatment of choice. If it is not available, we can go for amphotericin B lipid complex, or ABLC. That can be used in cases, but the patient must not be having a CNS involvement, and the renal parameters should be normal. There should not be any renal abnormality. The other form of amphotericin B that is available is very cheap. The cost is very less. That is amphotericin B deoxycholate, but this is a highly nephrotoxic drug. So the treatment of choice is liposomal amphotericin B is the first line of treatment, but that is very costly, and it is not available plentifully. Of course, there is a scarcity of liposomal amphotericin B throughout India. So depending we have on the availability, the severity of the patient, we have to choose our treatment. So the dose is liposomal amphotericin B in rhinonasal and rhinoorbital cases. The dose is 5 milligram per kg per day. But if there is CNS involvement, this will be 10 milligram per kg per day, with repeated follow-up with serum urea creatinine, serum sodium, potassium, and magnesium. The ABLC, the dose is same 5 milligram per kg per day. But the amphotericin B deoxycholate, since it's a very nephrotoxic drug, the dose is low, 1.5 milligram per kg per day. The full per day doses should be started from the first day onwards. There should not be any escalation of the dose. The full dose should be started from the very beginning. Of course, in case of CKD patients, we can there is a guideline by the company, the AmbiJob. The guideline is you start with a 0.25 milligram per kg per day, and then go on increasing by 0.2 milligram per day until you reach the level of 3 milligram per kg per day. So in case of CKD patients, but in a normal patient, you start the full dose from the first day. So after amphotericin B, we have to step down the injection of the amphotericin B, or in situations where the amphotericin B is not available, or if the amphotericin B is the patient is not responding to amphotericin B, then we have to think of other treatments like posaconazole and isavuconazole. These are available both in injectable form and oral form. The dose of posaconazole is 300 milligram twice daily in the first day, followed by 300 milligram once daily for many weeks. Or the syrup form is also available. That you can give in the form of 15 ml for thrice daily. The dose of isavuconazole is 200 milligram 3 times a day for first 2 days, followed by 200 milligram once daily. So this has to be monitored by doing a liver function test regularly. As I told you, the monitoring of the disease is very important by clinical method, by radiological method, and endoscopic examination is must. And when you discharge the patient, you have to instruct the patient to have a tight control over the blood sugar. Watch out for red flag symptoms like headache and vomiting and all those things. There's symptoms of CNS involvement. Maintain good hygiene. Wear a mask. Even if you have recovered from COVID, do not forget to wear a mask, because when you are going outside, the chances that you may get muco from the areas where the buildings are being built, or any farming areas, where the incidence of mucor is very high. You can get an infection from there. And get vaccinated. That's very important. Everyone should get vaccinated. And gardening with gloves and avoid construction sites. Follow up with a doctor regularly. So medical legal issues. There are many medical legal issues associated with mucor, because as you know, it's a very devastating disease. You need to take out many organs, sometimes giving a disfigure to the patient. Sometimes the patient may not be having anything but land up in a renal failure or kidney disease. So you have to document everything. You have to take consent before giving any treatment or any surgery or any medical treatment. You have to take a consent. Surgical treatment protocol found by the government to be followed very strictly, because any deviation from the protocol may be sued in the court of law. The drug availability is another issue, because if you assure a patient that okay, you have got mucor, I will treat you, but you should tell him at the same time, because there is a paucity of the supply of the amphotericin B, you should also tell them that there is less availability of the drug. If you want to be treated, I can treat with alternative drugs like isavuconazole, posaconazole, but amphotericin B is not available. That you have to tell beforehand. And toxicity you have to keep in mind, because all the drugs, even posaconazole, isavuconazole have got some toxicity. So these things you have to keep in mind. And the cost of the drugs are very high, very, very high. So these things should be explained to the patient beforehand. And prognosis, as you know, the prognosis of the patient is a very poor prognosis. All the mucor cases, the mortality is very high, and the recurrence rate is also high. That has also to be explained to the patient beforehand. The mortality rate, all-cause mortality rates for mucormycosis ranges from 40 to 80% rate. Depends on the underlying condition, the site of infection. The 40 to 80%, the mortality rate of mucormycosis, even after very good surgical debridement and amphotericin B, is 40 to 80%. That is why it is a very dreaded disease. The highest survival rates are reported in patients with healthy immune status and those without comorbidities. These are the good candidates, those who have survived the mucor. The poorest prognosis is observed in patients with hematological malignancies and hematopoietic stem cell transplantation recipients, and patients with extensive burns. The good thing about this post-COVID mucormycosis is the prognosis is little better, because the predisposing factors, mostly diabetes, that is easily controllable. But in hematological malignancies or hematopoietic stem cell transplant patients where the immunity is very low, there sometimes the immunity cannot be improved by any therapeutic means. But in diabetic patient, at least you control the diabetes. One of the predisposing factors is now nullified. The prognosis is a little bit better as compared to hematological malignancies. Disseminated disease, especially to CNS, is often associated with a high mortality rate that is more than 80%. Conversely, lower mortality is seen with a localized sinus or skin infection. You excise the disease completely. What is the role of surgery? The role of surgery is, first, you have to take a biopsy. You have to decrease the fungal load. You have to take a biopsy. You have to excise the tissue. You have to decrease the fungal load. The main role of surgery is you have to decrease the fungal load so that your antifungals will work better. The dose of antifungals will be less. The total duration of treatment will be less, because the number of fungus, the amount of fungus that is already reduced by surgery, by taking out them by the surgery. So antifungal is a must. So, but the lower mortality rate is seen with localized sinus or skin infections, because it can be excised completely. Mortality is also higher in neonates and other immunocompromised patients. So there is a controversy regarding the prophylactic drug treatment for mucormycosis. There's a controversy regarding suppose someone has recovered from COVID-19 and you're suspecting he may develop mucormycosis in future. Should we prescribe antifungals to him or not? It is controversial. ICMR is denying there is no role of prophylactic mucormycosis, but it is recommended as a primary prophylaxis in neutropenic patients or those with graft versus host disease as a primary prophylaxis, or secondary prophylaxis in immunosuppressed patients with previously diagnosed mucormycosis and the patient has undergone surgical resection already and is in a continuation or restart of the last drug is effective in that patient, then it is strongly recommended. If it has already has suffered from mucormycosis, has undergone surgery and undergone treatment, again showing features susceptibility of development of mucormycosis, then you can go for a secondary prophylaxis. But just post-COVID patients anticipating for mucormycosis to develop, the prophylaxis, prophylactic antifungal is controversial. So these are a few algorithms where when all treatment modalities and antifungal drugs are available, you can go for a surgical debridement with clean margins for serving three purposes, as I told you: disease control, histopathology, and microbiological diagnosis, plus immediate treatment initiation. First, you go for a debridement, then you start liposomal amphotericin B at a dose, as I told you. In case of brain involvement, you go for a double dose that is 10 milligram per kg per debate. And if it is not available, you can go for isavuconazole, posaconazole, or liposomal amphotericin B in case of less than 5 milligram per day in case of renal involvement. And again, reassess if it is responding to the disease, stable disease or partial response, then continue the first line of treatment. Alternately, you can think about isavuconazole or posaconazole. But if it is progressive, then you continue with liposomal amphotericin B. And if there is signs of toxicity, then you stop amphotericin B and change to isavuconazole or posaconazole. So if liposomal amphotericin B is not available, what will do then? Then you have to go for a first is suspected and confirmed mucormycosis cases have to be taken as emergencies and do a surgical debridement. Then if pre-existing renal compromise there, then you start isavuconazole or posaconazole. And but you have to avoid this amphotericin B deoxycholate. As per this guideline, amphotericin B deoxycholate has to be avoided because it is nephrotoxic. Response assessment is done weekly. If it is stable or partial response, then continue the first line of treatment. If progressive, then also you continue. And toxicity, then you have to stop. So when isavuconazole, posaconazole, and delayed release tablets both are not available, then you have to think about the low dose amphotericin B. So treatment during duration for mucormycosis. This is another question asked by many. How long we should continue the treatment? The guidelines. Guideline groups strongly support treatment until permanent reversal of immunosuppression and complete response on imaging, which might be difficult to determine because of scarring and post-operative changes. Some people recommend to go for a repeat imaging study after treatment to know what is the status of the disease. But if you do MRI scan or the CT scan after surgery, there may be scarring or post-operative changes that may confuse you with the presence of the active disease. So some people are not are of opinion of not doing it repeatedly. The treatment duration is a personalized decision. Mainly it is mainly the treatment is monitored by doing serum markers of or inflammatory markers like CRP and ESR. If the CRP is you have to do a serial gradual CRP estimation. If the CRP level is falling and ESR is falling, then definitely the patient is responding to the treatment, and you can stop the treatment once the CRP becomes normal. There is a moderate support for intravenous treatment of use of isavuconazole or posaconazole or delayed release tablet is strongly recommended. And posaconazole oral suspension can also be used, but is marginally supported, especially when formulations with higher exposure are available. So how to prevent? Poorly controlled diabetes is a major issue. So good glycemic control during management of COVID patient is very much required. Systemic steroids should only be used in patients with hypoxemia. The general public should be educated regarding the use of steroid. They should not be using steroid as soon as they get diagnosed to be a COVID positive. It has to only to be used in patients if they develop hypoxia And oral steroids are contraindicated in patients with normal oxygen saturation, so they should not take it. And if systemic steroid is used, blood sugar should be monitored very regularly and in a stringent manner. The dose and duration of steroid therapy should be limited to 5 to 10 days, not very longer. And universal masking reduces exposure to mucorales. Avoidance of construction sites and plantation areas should be told to the post-COVID patients. They should not go to those areas. And during discharge of the patient, advice about the early symptoms or signs of mucormycosis, that is facial pain, nasal blockage, excessive discharge, loosening of tooth, chest pain, respiratory insufficiency. If they develop, then they should immediately come to the doctor and get themselves examined. And particularly ENT surgeon, go for an endoscopic examination of the nose early for the disease to be diagnosed in the early stage. So ICMR, Indian Council of Medical Research, has also put forth its guidelines that we have already discussed. So in their guideline, the one thing I want to highlight is no antifungal prophylaxis is needed in case of post-COVID patients, as they have mentioned. So the take-home message is, first is host factor is important as mucorales are ubiquitous. Mucor fungus is present everywhere. So if you want to, it affects those where the host factor is susceptible. So we cannot eliminate mucor from the surroundings. We have to improve the host factor. Judicious use of steroid and immunosuppressants are to be judged during COVID infection, and good glycemic control in hospital and home. After discharge from the hospital, in the home also, there should be a good glycemic control. And aggressive surgical debridement is a cornerstone of successful outcome. Not only antifungal will not do any good work. It should be done along with, it should be prescribed along with a good surgical debridement. And liposomal amputation is the preferred line of treatment. And regular follow-up, that is post-COVID periodic nasal endoscopy, is very much required. So the few lines about the Cortimax. I thank the Juventus people from the core of my heart for giving this opportunity for a good discussion today evening. So the Cortimax is preferable over prednisolone. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Himanshu, Dr. Mamta Sahu. Can I have Dr. Himanshu? Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, good evening, Doctor.
Hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, sir.
Yes.
Yeah. So thanks a lot, Sanjit Bhai, for the nice deliberate presentation, taking all the aspects. Just to add a few points that because many of the senior teachers are also here. First thing is, there is a retrospective study done by different hospitals. It has shown that if you take appropriate steroid that Bhai has mentioned, if you take appropriate steroid for 10 days course of therapy, then there is very few chance of development.
Yeah. Dr. Himanshu's net, I think, is a little bit weak.
But 80% cases have been seen that the patient have not been admitted, but they have developed mucormycosis. Another study shows that the patient. Can you hear me?
Sir, your voice was not audible for a second because of, I guess, the network seems to be weak. Yeah.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Now we can hear, sir. Now we can hear you.
Yeah. So the retrospective study shows that why there is a very much increase in cases of mucormycosis in second wave. You know that everybody is nowadays using indigenous medicines. We have heard about Gilead. Many people are taking Gilead, and the study shows that the Gilead contains a high dose of steroid. So unknowingly, patients are taking steroid in a higher dose. We are taking Chyawanprash, we are taking Gilead for a long time in indigenous medicine. So there may be a high chance of severe. So in that cases, we have seen, and the studies have been proven that in that cases also development of mucormycosis. And regarding glycemic control, another study has been shown. It is shown that if the blood sugar control is between 140 to 180, then there is very less chance of developing mucormycosis. But one thing is that the mucor itself or the delta variant itself, it unmarks diabetes. So many people who are not diabetic previously, they are being diabetes, they are proven diabetic during the time of mucor. Another thing I want to highlight that another study shows that overuse of azithromycin and the geoclimatic condition is also a risk factor for developing mucormycosis. And regarding the nosocomial infections, one WHO has notified a disease called black mole in 2013. It is a fungal condition, not mucormycosis. It's a fungal condition, black mole. And it has shown that the cause is due to infected use of methylprednisolone vials. So all these things should taken into action. Another thing is regarding pathogenesis. There is a protein called GRP78. So in diabetic ketoacidosis patients, we have seen that in mucormycosis, the study shows that there is a high expression of the protein called GRP78 that predisposes to infection. And regarding nosocomial infection, studies have been shown that why patients admitted into ICU as having mucormycosis. It has been mentioned in ICMR guideline also, at least once in 10 days, you should change the IV lines. And second thing is that if the patient is developing mucor within 2 weeks of the admission or within 2 weeks of the discharge of the admission, then it may be taken as nosocomial infection. Regarding diagnosis is 3 types. One is proven, one is probable, and the third is putative. So my ENT colleagues are there. So don't take nasal endoscopy is the final diagnosis. If sometimes we have seen patients, the nasal endoscopy is normal, but there is presence of mucor. So the most proven diagnosis is biopsy, as I have told. Second thing is your MRI PNS with contrast. MRI PNS with contrast, and sometimes they're doing the bronchial lavage also, BAL. And putative is nasal endoscopy. So in nasal endoscopy is not suggestive of anything. A person is having headache or person is having any symptoms, then go for a MRI PNS with contrast. Regarding MRI, one thing I want to highlight, if the ethmoid sinus is involved, then it is a alarming sign. So that this is a guide factor to the patient may involve cerebral mucormycosis. And regarding treatment, don't give empirical therapy. It is my personal opinion. Don't give empirical therapy. Studies have been shown that when there is a rhinocerebral mucormycosis, if you delay the treatment for 6 days only, the mortality rate is double to 2 times. So don't give empirical therapy. To do a biopsy, because the surgery is devastating condition. The drugs are highly nephrotoxic. So don't start a drug unless otherwise proved. So do a biopsy, do a KOSMAT, anything you want, but just wait for a while. It will take hardly 6 to 8 hours or sometimes 24 hours to start the therapy. Then just start the therapy, just start, do a biopsy, send it for the treatment, send it for the confirmation, then you can go for therapy. And another study has been shown that if you regularly use, I have seen descriptions of some patients that patients have been given voriconazole because posaconazole, isoflurane not available, was not available here in Berhampur. So patients were advised voriconazole, patients are advising fluconazole by quacks and medicine shops. But studies shows that icosapongins and voriconazole, if you regularly use, then it can increase the chance of mucormycosis. So you have to be very judicious. The regular OTC uses and our carelessness is giving rise to the black mucor, the black fungus. So another thing I want to highlight that about serum ferritin, iron gelatin therapy, it is most sought therapy nowadays. Everybody is telling. Only there is no strong evidence of giving iron gelatin therapy. But it's seen that if the serum ferritin is more than 490 or 500, then there is high chance of suspicion of mucormycosis. But my take-home message from this talk will be, don't start empirical therapy. The mortality rate is very high. Go for MRI PNS contrast. Even patients I have seen that MRI PNS suggested mucormycosis. The patient had been admitted. The biopsy has been taken. Double biopsy, triple biopsy has been done because of a VVIP patient, and it is nothing suggestive. So the patient has been discharged. So don't start empirical therapy unless otherwise there is a strong proven condition, like you are seeing a black scar, you are seeing mutating condition, then it is okay. Otherwise, if there is slight suspicion, only sinus involvement, then don't do empirical therapy. Better to go for a biopsy. But very nice deliberation by Sanjit Bhai. And now I wait for the words of Dr. Mamta Soy Madam.
Yeah.
Very good evening. Thank you, Dr. Sanjit, for a very nice presentation. And regarding yes, good evening. Thank you, Dr. Sanjit, for very nice presentation, and Dr. Himanshu for very nice discussion. And according to my view, there are 3 things which are important for the mucor search. One is COVID-19 associated with uncontrolled diabetes mellitus. Another one is injudicious use of the steroid. So first, once comes to the patient, the COVID patient, we must have to assess the sugar status first. By HbA1c is the most. Then we give judiciously the steroid if there is need of steroid. When there is oxygen saturation comes down. One is time of starting of the steroid, dose of steroid, and duration of steroid is most important. The steroid itself increase the level of the blood sugar. So time when not hurriedly, before there is any saturation comes down, don't start any oral steroid or IV steroid. Then dose must be, there is prednisolone, give 6 milligram, and prednisolone you give, this is 40, and methylprednisolone is 32 milligram per day. Then this duration should not be more than 10 days. Then at the time of during the hospitalized patient, the monitoring is important. And sometimes the patients comes to us with mucor, but they are unaware of their diabetes. But blood sugar, there is the high sugar, that is more than 300, 400. But they are unaware of their home isolation. There is mild fever. Patient is having complaint of taking vaccine 1 dose or 2 dose, or mild fever, mild symptomatic in the home isolation. Then after 2 weeks comes with us with the help of with the complaint of the mucor or discharge from the nose or blackish coloration around the eye, or there is bloody discharge, or there is the decrease in the vision, or sometimes there is the chance of there is also patients comes to us with the CNS manifestation. We have admitted 9 cases. We lost 2 cases without any diagnosis, without any microbiological or any radiological diagnosis, but clinical diagnosis mucormycosis. Before diagnosis, confirmed diagnosis, we lost these 2 patients. And out of 7 patients, we have diagnosed all these cases by nasal endoscopy, doing microbiological assess, and by the MRI. And we operated 4 cases successfully and started amphotericin B and followed by posaconazole. On after 10 days, all patients are now stable now. Okay, so my view is after the discharge, after discharging the patient, those who are prone for the mucor infection should be kept in the hospital. There is a separate hospital, and there is a team of the mucor team should follow these patients. Those who are suspicious of mucor, we are thinking that these patients may develop mucor infection. So there should be a special ward, special hospital for these patients, not for all discharged patients, but highly suspicious patients. So we can monitor the sugar level. We can monitor, assess if any suspicious, any headache, mild diplopia, or any pain, any discharge. We can do early diagnosis by nasal endoscopy or by the MRI, and by taking the scars or tissue from the nasal endoscopically, then we can diagnose easily. So my take-home message is there should be all patients admitted to hospital in the COVID hospital. First, assess the HbA1c level. Then you treat the patient. Then during discharge, if there are highly suspicious cases or those who are chance of infection by the mucor should admitted in a special hospital, and during discharge give the instruction to the patient that they should be indoor for 2 weeks because there is immune status is low. So first they increase their strong their immune status, and there is chance of 110 to 100 times chance of mucor infection if they go outside than in a home isolation for 2 weeks at least. So this is my take-home message. Thank you. And thanks to the, Dr. Sanjit, Dr. Himanshu, and the team of Juventus.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Dr. Mamta. Sanjit sir, can we get some questions? I know because we are running short of time, but
sure,
I think,
no.
yeah, please,
hello.
I mean, yeah.
Am I audible?
Yeah, audible. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I am Dr. Kadal Das. Actually, I am a medicine specialist.
Yes.
What is my
Good
question
evening,
is,
sir.
good evening. Very lucid presentation I had, and thank you very much. But I have got one simple suggestion. See, MRI with contrast or MRI with angiography is not the gold standard. Because I must tell you, I've seen a patient 15 years back during my PG days when I was working in a transplant hospital, post-hematological transplant patient. Patient had some seizure and fever, headache. So we did MRI. The MRI said most likely the patient is suffering from mucormycosis. So we started the patient on amphotericin 15 years back, lysosomal, but didn't respond. So then what we have to do is that we have to go for a brain biopsy, whether the patient is suffering from mucor or something else. So we diagnosed there post that it was a histoplasmosis. So MRI is not the gold standard. It is the QH mount or the biopsy which is the gold standard. And second thing is that what should be the duration of treatment for amphotericin B lysosomal? The duration from it varies from clinician to clinician. We have used to give for minimum 2 weeks, so 2 to 6 weeks. But only problem with this amphotericin is if you don't hydrate the patient, if you don't monitor the kidney functions, you will lose the patient. Patient will develop AKI and patient will die. And second thing, what I have observed, if you give amphotericin, you have to monitor calcium, magnesium, sodium, potassium every third day, because there is hypokalemia plus there is hypomagnesemia. So one must understand that. So during amphotericin B, and the clinician or the surgeon is the best to choose what should be given. And those oral drugs, they are not that effective as compared to lysosomal amphotericin B. And third thing is what I have seen, diabetic control is must. If we don't control the diabetes, as Madam said, HbA1c monitoring, if you don't control diabetes, then the chances of getting mucormycosis is much. And why post-COVID they develop mucormycosis? Because there is an element of immunosuppression because of the virus. This virus causes immunosuppression, causes lymphopenia, and those the natural killer cells, it goes after that, and the chances of developing mucormycosis is very high. So these are my few points. Thank you for lucid presentation, Dr. Sanjit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Just to add, sir, exactly what you told is very correct. Amphotericin B that should be monitored very stringently. And in our ward, we are also treating many mucor cases. We have operated them, and we are seeing one patient developed hypokalemia. But so soon after some time, we supplemented with KCl, and he recovered also. It's a very good improvement. And all of them are being followed up by doing periodical serum urea, creatinine, sodium, potassium, magnesium, and CRP and ESR also. The CRP level also shows a decreasing trend in an improving patient. But the monitoring should be very stringent, and also posaconazole, isavuconazole are not as effective as amphotericin B. But one thing, the first question, first point what you told, exactly the tissue diagnosis of the mucor the organism mucor in the tissue is a gold standard of diagnosis. MRI is never the gold standard of diagnosis. MRI is very much required to guide the surgeon to do the surgery, to what extent he will go doing surgery, to what extent he will remove the tissues, to know the amount of diseased tissue. The MRI, gadolinium eminence MRI will guide you. But the gold standard of diagnosis is definitely Kovacs mount and fungal culture and histopathology. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, doctor. Is there any other question? I think, doctor, there's no, because the entire presentation they must have answered the probable question they must be having. Is there any questions? So we'll. Okay, it seems, I think, sir, there's no question.
Just, I want to add one point to Dr. Himanshu. Right. See, there are many. This was your question also, Mr. Pandey. So, yes. Why there is a resurgence of mucormycosis after COVID? As we know, the mucormycosis occurs in immunocompromised patients. The number of immunocompromised patients has increased post-COVID. So naturally, going by the rule, the incidence has increased. But this increase has gone out of proportion with which, because the steroids were being also prescribed for other diseases for a prolonged period, lifelong steroids they were being given. But why there is a resurgence of mucormycosis after getting steroid for a few days in COVID? There must be something which is unknown, which is hidden. So probably the answer is that Delta strain. The Delta strain causes because see, there is a mucor everywhere. It is ubiquitous everywhere in the environment, and in a mucor patient, it has got entry into the nasal mucosa. It has entered it is angioinvasive fungus. It has got entered into the blood vessel. So some cause that breaches that barrier between the fungus and the blood vessel. That barrier has gone. That is why the fungus has entered into the blood vessel. So probably because of the cytokine storm maybe there is intravascular coagulation, pulmonary thrombosis has occurred because of which the D-dimer is increased in many patients. So because of this thrombosis, might be the thrombus has got embolized into the head and neck area, and the sphenopolitan, that is internal maxillary artery, is the culprit, and where the when the embolus lodges in the internal maxillary artery, the branches of the internal maxillary artery to which the areas to which it supplies get ischemic, get necrosed, and that is the entry point of the fungus into the blood vessel. Probably this is one of the answers, because why there are many schools of thoughts are there, many predisposing factors are there, but why the incidence has occurred more after the second wave, not when it was there. And the incidence has occurred also after the first wave. But why after second wave so much of increase? Maybe this is probably because of the strain of the virus that is causing the second wave, and because of the enormous the storm is very tsunami-like storm. Right. It's not a simple storm. Maybe.
Yeah. Another point
may explain it better. The physicians.
Right.
If they can answer better.
Yeah, Dr. Himanshu. Another point I want to add that when there is a nosocomial infection or infection spread by the community-acquired mucormycosis, it has seen in some studies that if there is community-acquired mucormycosis, then there are two types of mucormycosis which is more than rhinocerebral, because rhino-ocular cerebral is not community-acquired mostly. The mostly commonly acquired mucormycosis is cutaneous and gastrointestinal. But what we have seen here is mostly the cutaneous part is very less and the gastrointestinal part is very less, and mostly because of that rhinocerebral mucormycosis is happening. That's why what I have told that the ubiquitous thing is that it is present everywhere. It is omnipresent. It is present in my nose. It is present in your nose. Everybody's nose is there mucormycosis. But in there will decrease in the host factor. It increases.
And another point I'm very curious about to know, is the HbA1c role is very much high? Because HbA1c, as we know, HbA1c is the average of the blood glucose of the last 3 months. And we have seen that the blood glucose level of the patients which are on steroids, and after 2 weeks and 3 weeks, they are developing steroids, they are developing mucormycosis. So HbA1c play a very least role, I think. I play some role, but the screening of the patients with blood sugar level during COVID period, during steroid period, and after discharge of the COVID, it is very much essential. If you will take only HbA1c, I think it is my opinion. I don't know. The physicians can answer better. But it is my opinion that HbA1c is just average of 3 months. If a patient is developing COVID and the diabetes is unmasked, and we know that the COVID viruses sometimes attacks beta cells of the pancreas. So the patients who are normal, euglycemic, they develop diabetic ketoacidosis.
So I beg to differ. Because there are 4 types of hyperglycemia patients present. The co-occurs after COVID. So first is the patients who are known diabetics. After getting COVID infection and after getting steroid, the diabetes level gets increased. They become more, the sugar level increases many-fold. Those who are pre-diabetic, they become frank diabetic. Those who get steroid, the steroid-induced diabetes they develop after the treatment of the COVID. Those are non-diabetic, getting the steroid, they again develop hyperglycemia. Another group is those who are non-diabetic, not got steroid, but still they become diabetic because of the affection of the beta cells of the pancreas. So what happens to know the diabetic status of the patient is very important, because many patients they tell us we have come across practically. So they tell that, sir, we didn't have any diabetes, but we have developed mucormycosis. But if you do a HbA1c, then at least you can know the patient was having diabetes, but it has gone unnoticed until he has developed these symptoms of mucormycosis. So to differentiate people who were diabetic before developing COVID, but they have never noticed that, you have to go for a HbA1c study. To differentiate them, to know at least the actual status of the diabetes.
But how it helps, I think, how it helps. If the HbA1c level, is there any thing showing that HbA1c level is more than 6 or more than 7 or more than 8? Then
if it is very high, the HbA1c is very high, that means they already had a poor glycemic control before developing COVID. And your goal should be the tight control of the sugar level, because if it is low, the rise in sugar level may be transient, maybe because of the COVID itself, and you have to give treatment for a particular time until the patient recovers. But if the HbA1c level is very high, then you have to tell the patient you are having diabetes and you want lifelong treatment.
Okay.
I think, sir, we can close the session. Is there any question? I think it seems. Yeah. So, sir, any question? Okay. I think there's no questions, because I think I can see the intense presentation shared by you must have answered their queries. And there's addition insights from Dr. Himanshu and Dr. Mamta Sahu. So, sir, once again, I will take pleasure from Zuventus to thankful to you taking out your time from such a busy schedule, and giving an insight from the management and different treatment modalities for especially the COVID associated mucormycosis. And I'm very much sure, sir, this presentation will help to many participants and clinicians, those who attended, to immediate management, how to diagnose it. Once again, I'm thankful to all the participants, and surely they must have get benefited from this intense presentation from Dr. Sanjit Mishra. And thank you so much, Dr. Himanshu Chaudhary and Dr. Mamta Sahu. Once again, a special thanks to Dr. Sanjit Mishra, sir. Thank you so much. What a presentation it was. Sir, I have recorded entire session, so surely I will present to you tomorrow, sir.
Sure, sir. Thank you. That will be very
Thank you
nice.
so much, sir. Thank you so much once again from behalf of Juventus family. Yeah. Thank you, sir. I'm closing the.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Himanshu. Thank you, madam.
Thank you, sir.